or something like that. I think the other wouldn't say, oh, this is just what you sense. You don't just sense God is present. I mean, I think we would form the belief that God is present and so forth, the same as we do with tables and chairs and so forth. Anyway, there's a lot there, but we've taken long. I want to leave time for questions.
All right, so now the floor is open for questions, so please line up behind the microphones. Yes, please, Professor Swinburne.
I believe in both the core assumption and the probabilistic assumption, but they must be stated very carefully. The probabilistic assumption should be stated as that the rationality of a belief is proportional to the probability of the belief on the total available evidence. Probability on the total available evidence. The core assumption is presumably the assumption that it's useful to assess the core. And the obvious reason why it's useful to assess the core is if you consider two propositions P and Q, such that P entails Q and the ramified version entails the core version, then the probability of the ramified version on certain evidence must inevitably be either less than or in extreme cases equal to the probability of the core on the same evidence. That follows from the calculus and is independently motivating. Well, given that, then your examples simply don't bear out your criticism of these assumptions, because you take two theories, quantum theory and some somewhat implausible rival to it, and you point out that we can and do have evidence which supports the rival as against quantum theory, but you seem to suggest that these assumptions rule that out, but I can't see why, because a small bit of evidence, not the total evidence, may indeed raise the probability of the rival theory a tiny bit. It was very improbable anyway, and it raises it a tiny bit. And it may diminish the probability of quantum theory a tiny bit, but it was very probable anyway. So, of course, we discount this evidence because it doesn't make any difference to any significant difference to the overall probability. And that seemed to me all that was the only thing you were trying to draw out of these examples was that it ought to make a great difference, and it doesn't, and it doesn't follow from these assumptions that it should.
Okay, I assume that's addressed to me. Well, I got a few responses. I mean, you raised many issues, as always, Richard. And so, for one thing, when you said you accept the probabilistic assumption, I think you're actually looking at a different account of evidence. Of probability. You're looking at sort of what's often called absolute confirmation in the literature. I believe that's what you're talking about instead of...
I'm describing probability on the evidence. I think to call it a form of confirmation is misleading, because confirmation, as tradition interprets, is the proportion by which the theory is raised or lowered by the evidence.
Right. I mean, I was just looking at... Some of my arguments will not work against absolute confirmation. I agree. Some of the examples were designed specifically for incremental confirmation.
These examples.
And so, with regard to absolute confirmation, I mean, you're right. As I say, the core will be at least as probable as the regular theory. I mean, that's right. It seems to me if I understand you right, you're saying if we look at the total evidence, some of these examples won't work. I mean, that may be so. I'm not quite seeing the import, if I understand. We generally don't look at let's see. So is your objection that my example, it only works because I looked at one piece of evidence and not the total evidence?
Yes, both that and the fact that you are interested in whether it raises or doesn't raise the probability, rather than whether it makes the probability low or high, which is...
Oh, okay. Well, let me say something why I chose what Boz calls the assessment principle, first of all. The reason I chose incremental confirmation, as I said, was it would be unusual to say we had some evidence for something if it actually lowered the probability. Now, this can't be, this doesn't capture our complete account of evidence. As far as I know, we don't have any analysis of evidence. All of the accounts out there have pretty big problems. But if something lowers the probability of a theory for me, even if it's likely on it, I'm very hesitant to say that's evidence for it. I'd want to hear more. And that's why later in the paper I talked about likelihoodism, or we could talk about other measures of evidential strength.
One from another in being able to see this in a different way, and can those be identified? And if they can be identified, is that something subject to some sort of empirical inquiry? I mean, can we look and see, well, here's a person who sees in a different way, and here are the psychological reasons for that?
I mean, I assume you're asking, is there like a scientific theory that can identify a working sensus divinitatis or something?
Yes, something like that.
Yeah, not that I know of. I mean, I can't rule out things like this in the future, but to me, a lot depends on the will, the direction of the heart. And I can't say what will happen in the future, but I don't know of any way to do that.
Well, yeah, and I don't want to take up time. It seems like more precision could be found there. I mean, it's a bit vague to me, but I'll stop there.
I want to try to raise the problem of evil within your framework. In the section where you consider the problem of evil without the standard view, you have a less austere version of theism and a less austere version of the data of evil. And so in the spirit of your move, I want to consider an even less, I want to expand the core a bit more for theism and expand the core a bit more for the data. Since it's plausible that incomprehension comes in degrees, I think that we could take theism prime to be God has a good reason for permitting evils which we couldn't fully understand, but yet don't seem to us utterly barbaric, or some such thing like that. And then expand unaware to unaware prime by adding the conjunct, and many of these evils seem barbaric. And so I think in that case, the probabilities might come out more favorable towards the proponent of the problem of evil when you expand them even more.
So if I understand your objection, if theism prime is that God has a good reason for permitting evil and we can't fully understand these, and lots of the evils are barbaric, they look barbaric to us?
The idea is that theism includes, plausibly, one might think that theism includes that God would not, though God would do things beyond our ability to fully comprehend, he would not do things that sort of stretched our minds beyond their elastic limit. And then, but it does seem that certain evils, at least for certain people, seems to stretch their concept of goodness beyond the elastic limit. And for those people, it seems like this alone would not work. You'd have to really get rich in order to handle that objection.
But for example, suppose I were to say that in the Old Testament there's accounts of God, supposedly commanding the Israelites to do various things. I mean, I can't understand any of that at all. I mean, some of it seems pretty awful. And yet, I can assume that God has a good reason, that there's something was going on there. I don't understand the situation. Perhaps it's been miscommunicated. Something would go on. I think that there's a good explanation of it. So I don't think it has to. I mean, I'm not trying to argue that evil cannot be a problem for somebody. I'm saying it doesn't have to.
Okay, thanks much. Please.
I'd be happy to cede to Al if he'd like. I think that would be fitting. Do you want to ask your question, Al?
I guess rank hath its privileges. Or maybe it's a little rank, right? I want to say something about what Boz says, but I don't know exactly what to say. I've known Boz a very long time, and I've admired him all these years deeply. I've read some of his books and found many parts extremely informative, impressive, and even inspiring. But very often I don't understand him, you know. Now, when I was young and foolish, I thought, if I didn't